if we gave MDMA in a social context, that we reopened the social critical period. But if we gave MDMA in an isolation context, then we failed to reopen the critical period. We knew from the clinical trial results that context matters, right? You can't take MDMA and go to a rave and expect to cure your PTSD. You might become a better dancer, but you're probably not going to have the right context or the right setting to think about your trauma, to, do the therapeutic work that you need to have that lasting, durable change.
This podcast discusses psychedelic assisted therapy, which involves the use of substances that are illegal in many countries. We prioritize safety and do not encourage illegal drug use. Psychedelic therapy should only be conducted in controlled legal settings under professional supervision. Always consult a qualified healthcare provider before considering any form of treatment. Gul Dolen, thank you for being on the show. This is very exciting because I'm a huge fan of your research. Well, we are, basically.
Thank you very much. And delighted to be here.
Great, in this loungy situation for you. So, what is the topic you're going to talk about on a conference?
The conference this year is a little bit different than 2 years ago. 2 years ago, we had just come out with our critical period paper and our second critical period paper literally days before the conference. So that's what I talked about. This time, we don't have any new research that we're going to be discussing. So doing a fireside chat with Amy Emerson, and we're going to kind of cover whatever she finds to be most interesting about the work that we do. So I think we'll span a little bit of kind of the octopus stuff, the critical period stuff, our clinical trials, and then, we'll see where it goes.
Okay. But what made you so interested in this critical period? Because I saw your presentation in the Netherlands at the ICPR, and I really started to understand the first time, like, how this could be such an incredible opportunity. But maybe you should talk about why did you get into this specific topic?
Yeah, I think early on in my career, I realized that everything that makes us interesting and human is learned. And that's because learning and memory is a way to generate behavioral flexibility. And the way that is controlled by the brain is by these windows of time when learning and memory is especially easy and when you are especially able to learn from your environment. And those are called critical periods. And so just to give you an example, there aren't enough genes in the genome to encode every single behavior that a human can do. Instead, what we encode is the ability to learn. So it's the difference between, being genetically encoded to speak one language versus being genetically encoded to learn how to speak any one of 7,000 possible languages. And so this learning is responsible for everything. It's responsible for our personalities, it's our language, the way we walk, the way we talk, the way we see the world. And that is wonderful and gives us a huge amount of flexibility. But also it means that sometimes that learning goes wrong. And when that learning goes wrong, then we have what are traditionally called neuropsychiatric diseases. And so being able to reopen critical periods to get back to that state of learning that enables us to be flexible and learn from our environment, has been a goal of mine since I was a graduate student, 20 years ago.
And I mean, do we also have to imagine this, that let's say somebody has in these critical periods has experienced a trauma situation. So then this experience will basically always be with you in your system unless you reopen the critical period.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Yeah.
The idea is that the reason that, especially if you have a traumatic event that happens to you when you're young, when you're still in that normal developmental phase where you're learning when the critical period is open, then having that trauma at that time, you learn the trauma response. You learn to protect yourself against whatever it is that is causing the trauma, and then that gets locked in. And you really have a very difficult time unlearning those patterns of behavior, those things that were adaptive at the time but no longer serve you as an adult. And so the idea that you could reopen a critical period to change those learned patterns of behavior, has really been on the wish list for neuroscientists for, almost 100 years since we first discovered critical periods, right? Critical periods were first described in 1935 by Konrad Lorenz. And almost immediately after that, neuroscientists were on the hunt for ways to reopen these critical periods.
So did that inspire you also to answer this question on the list?
Yeah. So, basically, when I was a graduate student at MIT, I worked in a lab that was focused on critical periods, and we were focused on the visual system critical period. This is the critical period that enables visual processing and development of the circuitry that enables the visual system to see have binocular vision. And we were, at the time we were sort of debating with another lab that was at Harvard that was claiming that they were on the hunt for these master keys. And I was very much of the opinion that at the time that we would never find such master keys, because anything that could do that to the brain would cause amnesia or seizure or structural instability to the brain. And so I was interested in understanding the mechanism, but very doubtful that we would ever find anything that would be able to be those master keys.
And then you discovered psychedelics.
Yes. Well, so then, when I first started my own lab, there was starting to be a lot more enthusiasm for psychedelics. The first phase 1 and phase 2 trials were coming out by MAPS showing, a remarkable efficacy of MDMA for PTSD. And every time I would go to a conference, every time I would talk to people, I would ask them about mechanism. And in general, the response was, we don't need to know mechanism. We know that they work, and that's all that's required to get approval from the FDA. So, we don't need to do these kind of mechanistic studies. And so when my lab discovered that psychedelics are, in fact, opening the critical period that we discovered, it seemed like, oh, this is the missing link. This is two conversations that are happening in parallel, and we are being the bridge between the neuroscientists who are trying to open critical periods, thinking that might help us with clinical trials, and then the people conducting clinical trials with psychedelics getting amazing results but not knowing why. And so we thought that this explanation for the efficacy of the trials met a lot of the touchstones that we would want to say that this is actually the mechanism.
And did you also have like a personal moment where you had that experience that one of your critical periods was suddenly available to change?
Yeah, so I'll back up and tell you a little bit the history of it. So when we first started, my lab studies social behaviors, and I had noticed when I was a postdoc where I had characterized this social reward learning, that it seemed to be harder to induce in older animals compared to younger animals. So my incredibly talented and tenacious postdoc, when I started my own lab, he took this up. His name was Raman Nardu, and he essentially did this incredible study where he looked at 15 different ages, both sexes, hundreds and hundreds of animals, and characterized social reward learning across development. And he said, okay, this follows the same pattern as other critical periods. But when I started talking about this at conferences, people didn't really believe that this was a real critical period, because so many of the classical critical periods are in the visual system, in the somatosensory touch system, in the motor system. They're sort of hard critical periods. And this was an emotional critical period about social behaviors. And so people were like, that's not a real critical period. And so we thought, if we're really going to convince people, we have to have a way of reopening and then discover something about the mechanism. And that's when we started thinking about MDMA, because we knew from people who were using it recreationally, we knew from the clinical trials that, MDMA has these incredible pro-social effects. And we thought, wouldn't it be amazing if this pro-social psychedelic, this empathogenic psychedelic, this empathogenic quality was enough to reopen this critical period. And so we started with MDMA because of its pro-social effects, and we thought that's what that unique property that isn't shared across psychedelics is what was accounting for this. And so we found that it reopened this social critical period, and that was a paper that we published in 2019, also in Nature. In that paper, our conclusions were basically, this is because MDMA is unique and special. It's pro-social. It's reopening this critical period because it's a social critical period. And this accounts for the clinical trial results because we think that it's essentially enabling the therapeutic alliance. It's allowing patients to reconnect with themselves and forgive themselves and, enter the world of social interaction through this reawakening of their social. But we already had the first hint that explanation wasn't quite right, because we also noticed and we also found that if we gave MDMA in a social context, that we reopened the social critical period. But if we gave MDMA in an isolation context, then we failed to reopen the critical period. So that context dependence of MDMA's ability to reopen the critical period was super interesting, because we knew from the clinical trial results that context matters, right? You can't take MDMA and go to a rave and expect to cure your PTSD. You might become a better dancer, but you're probably not going to have the right context or the right setting to think about your trauma, to, do the therapeutic work that you need to have that lasting, durable change. And so to my knowledge, to this day, our critical period explanation offers the first mechanistic explanation for this context dependence, and showing this context dependence was really important finding in our results. But it also suggested that it wasn't the pro-social properties of MDMA by themselves that were responsible for the reopening, and that it was the social context that was supervising the reopening of the social critical period. So in order to test that idea, in the next paper, what Roman did was to look at all of the psychedelics. And so going back to your question about the aha moment, basically it looks something like this. Roman brought me the data from the LSD, and it reopened. And I was like, no, that's wrong. Do it again. And then he did it again, and he got the same result. And then I made a couple of other people in the lab do it, not Roman,
Wow.
and they also got the same result. And so then I was sort of convinced, like, this is not something that's specific. Nobody's doing a 30-person cuddle puddle on LSD. It's just not the same kind of psychedelic. It's more of the hallucinogenic psychedelic, whereas MDMA is this pro-social psychedelic. So then we thought, oh, well, maybe this is just all drugs, right? Any drug that people might use recreationally. We knew that wasn't right because we had previously shown that cocaine does not reopen this critical period. So it's not that these animals are having a good time, a nice party, and then remembering how fun it is to be social.
No, they were depressed afterwards, these animals, I guess.
And so the cocaine experiment also didn't work. So the cocaine didn't reopen. So then we started looking at all of the psychedelics. And so we looked at ibogaine, we looked at psilocybin, we looked at MDMA, we looked at ketamine, and we compared across all of these different classes of psychedelics, and all of them reopened. And so this really sort of was an aha moment that said, oh, what it is to be in that altered state of consciousness that's common to all psychedelics is maybe just what it feels like to reopen critical periods. So that's our sort of working model of what's going on.
Okay.
here.
And I want to come back to the moment when you saw a sea urchin as a child.
Okay.
And then you realized this is so weird that you need to research this, something like this.
Yeah.
Is that
Yes.
around about the right idea?
I mean, yeah, I grew up in Texas, where most of the swimming that we did was in a neighborhood swimming pool. And it was, very sterile and clean and chlorinated. And then I remember when I was, 7 or 8 years old, we went to go visit my grandparents in Turkey. And for the first time, I was told, okay, you're going to get in the ocean. And I could see at the bottom of the ocean all of these, black sea urchins. and with their spines, and I was terrified, and I refused to get in. But my grandmother was a zoologist, and so she, was not having it. So she took one of the sea urchins and she flipped it over and showed me its teeth and showed me its stomach and showed me how it was able to move its spines to direct food to its mouth. And I was just blown away. I was just instantly fascinated and just amazed at how quickly having that scientific curiosity, that knowledge about the strangeness of the world can transform something from being terrifying to being just the most fascinating thing you've ever
and
seen.
Also be a delicious thing to
and
order.
It's also, when I was 8, I don't think I was ready for eating sea urchins. I love it now, but yes, I knew the French tourists who come to Turkey love the sea urchin because they're sort of all over the coast. You can see like the
but that
boats.
was an important moment in your life, like to see this little monster basically being this kind of wonder of in nature. Basically.
Yeah. So I think having that idea and really the ocean has called to me in that way because there's so much strange life in the ocean, and I've always been from that moment just drawn to it. And it wasn't ever like at that time formulated in my mind as a career that I might look forward to. My sister was very much more like focused on what she was going to do as her job when she was older, and she was much more career minded, and I was kind of this like head in the clouds, just spending hours and hours on the beach looking at all the little critters and collecting rocks, and I was really just more like wandering around collecting things. And ironically, this is totally irrelevant, but my sister has now turned out to be this like basically hippie living in.
Oh, so you switched roles, basically.
And I'm the like career woman, and I've got the lab and the degrees, and my sister gave up her dreams of becoming an investment banker to essentially protest against investment banks. It's the strangest thing. Anyway.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. So.
But I also like then when you follow your path. This is one article described you that your favorite classes then were, as a becoming neuroscientist, drugs, the brain, and behavior.
Yes.
So how did you put this together? Did you made like a cocktail that you were interested in, or how did this come together that you went on this path at all? Yeah.
So I was an undergraduate at Duke University, and I was trying to figure out what my major was going to be. And so Duke had a rule that you couldn't be a triple major. And if you had, interests in that many different fields, they really encouraged you to design your own major. So I designed my own major, and it was called Comparative Perspectives on the Mind. And it was sponsored by the neuroscience and the philosophy departments. And, it was a combination of neuroscience classes, psychology classes, philosophy classes, religion classes, art classes, just sort of linguistics, all kinds of different disciplines, and coming at the problem of the mind and consciousness from all of these different directions. And I think that, I was enjoying kind of this cross-disciplinary approach. I find that to be very, it inspires a lot of creativity in me to think about these border zones between fields. But I took this class called Drugs, Brain, and Behavior, and it really transformed the way that I was thinking about things, because I remember the day in class where we learned about the serotonin molecule and the LSD molecule side by side, and how they had structural similarity, which predicted that they would also occupy the same binding site, the same receptor in the brain. And to me, that was just an aha moment that everything that we think of as consciousness, personality, feeling, emotions, perceptions, was really just coming down to molecules interacting with each other. And I basically at that moment really took a turn more towards the physical sciences, more towards, physicalism as an explanation for the world, and really took the neuroscience path, basically starting then.
So, I mean, there's this quote, like you said, like everything you think and feel, everything you think makes you uniquely alive and aware of the world, comes down to molecules. So, like, is there like a contradiction for you in let's say, in terms of spirituality and molecules? Because I mean, this is the big psychedelic discussion.
Right.
But some people have this, maybe more the scientists have this approach of, well, it's molecules. And other people in the space would say, no, it's a spiritual moment. It's like a mystical experience. Can they actually collaborate or coexist, molecules and a spiritual moment?
Yeah, I've been getting this question a lot more lately. I'm not really sure why, but I
mean,
I would say
no.
that I've thought a lot about these questions, and ultimately what I have come down to is the belief that even the mystical experiences, even these spiritual encounters that people have, can be explained in terms of a physical molecular explanation. And I don't believe that we can do that right now, but I think at some point we will be able to make those kinds of explanations. And so in my worldview, the fact that you can take a pill, which is essentially just a molecule or a bunch of molecules, and dramatically alter consciousness means that consciousness comes down to molecules. And I know that there's a lot of pushback on this idea from the people who have these incredible mystical experiences. But I guess I would offer that, in some sense, the world that we normally occupy, our everyday world, perhaps feels not so mystical, mostly because we're used to it. And that what the psychedelic experience is enabling is a fresh view, a way of seeing the world that's very much like, we were experiencing it for the first time, very much like children. And so I think that feels very mystical, and I think it feels very, as William James put it, the noetic property of psychedelics. It feels really real, more real than our real encounters in everyday life. But I think that this critical period explanation offers a lot in terms of restoring the brain to that place of, like a child, seeing the world with fresh eyes.
I mean, I quickly want to come back to what you talked about in the beginning, that basically the research was also showing that people actually heal in community or in a context, as opposed to maybe just alone, or maybe just always only with a therapist. So is this something that influences your research, that kind of idea, like how this can work in a community or maybe in new communities that will appear in the next years? I mean, since the political system might be not something that people are oriented anymore by, so they look for their own community very often now.
Right.
So, and it seems to be like a whole new model of communities that might heal together also.
Right. Yeah. I mean, my lab, as I mentioned, studies social behaviors. And I remember when I was in medical school, we were required to attend Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous meetings as part of our psychiatry rotation. And I remember thinking that it seemed to me that the therapeutic effects that people were experiencing were not so much about giving themselves over to a higher power or following a bunch of rules. It really seemed to me that it was about social connection. These were people who had become socially isolated from the rest of their community, and these group therapy, peer facilitation programs were essentially allowing them to be part of a community again, to be responsible for somebody and be responsible to the whole group. And this social part of these approaches I was very impressed by, because humans are social animals. Unlike octopuses, humans really, really care about social, and they They heal from social. They are injured by being socially isolated for too long. And so it's not at all surprising to me that, and I actually even used to say, often when discussing these in the early days, people at the time when I first started thinking about psychedelics were saying that PTSD was just a disease of the amygdala. It's a fear response. It's an altered fear response. And I kept saying, no, I think PTSD is a disease of the social brain. You have a social injury. You have, a loss of social connection and a sort of turning inward that prevents you from having that healing interaction through social behaviors. So to me, it makes sense that these psychedelic drugs are reopening a social critical period if given in a social context. But I don't want to mislead and think that that's the only way that psychedelics can be therapeutically valuable. I do think that some people are able to get a lot of meaning and understanding of their whatever they're going through in other ways. And certainly the way that our research is headed, we're now exploring other ways to use psychedelics to treat diseases like stroke, where, it's not a social impairment, it's a motor impairment, right?
But what's a social injury?
So, in PTSD, typically for women, the traumatic injury is, rape or incest, and that is surprisingly common. And I think that's easily an injury of a social injury. I would say that, even for people who have been in war, there's a social injury component of having to do violence against other humans, having to witness your best friend or your, community of people who you're, in this very stressful situation in, who are your comrades who are helping you, to lose one of them and the guilt associated with surviving such a thing. These are all, I think, social injuries. And I don't think that, I used to have to explain this a lot, but then we went through the pandemic and everybody had to, have
everybody had social injuries.
Yeah, right. And so now everybody's like, yeah, of course we're social. Of course social matters. And of course that's the most important thing to us, right?
So that means also that, let's say, an MDMA therapy, maybe also with the MAPS protocol, or like in a guided setting, so could actually heal this social injury or kind of make it go away, or like at least make you aware that you have a social injury.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, again, it has to do with the context, right? So you could have all the social interaction that you want, but if you don't address the trauma, if you don't set the person up, days before during the preparation session to say, okay, the thing that we are going to work on, kind of get us in the ballpark of this trauma, really start to, not force people to focus on it, but just make that be present in their minds. And then the day of the trip, I think it's important to not be laser focused on getting to the trauma in one direction, because I think what the psychedelic is enabling is a sort of cognitive flexibility to get at how you conceptualize the trauma through different pathways in the brain that you hadn't been using. And that flexible approach to the trauma, sees to the traumatic event, helps you see better or recognize all of the ways that this one event has changed the way that you interact and help you to see other ways of interacting. And then afterwards, during the integration phase, you're taking this this experience that you had, this insight that happened through some amount of cognitive flexibility, and then building it back into your worldview. So the next time that you have a situation where you might be afraid, or you might withdraw, or you might push people away, suddenly through this insight, you recognize that and you integrate that into your new patterns of behaviors. And so I think the therapist is vital to creating the situation and the circumstances to help you through those things. But in many ways, I think the person is finding their path, through these experiences.
So you're able to have a conflict now without getting into several directions that you used to behave like around a conflict.
That's right.
So, but there's also a school. I had a conversation yesterday with somebody that seems to say, well, maybe what if you don't have to remember the trauma? What if your body is just releasing the energies that were stored? So, but from I already can see, like from a scientific point of view, this is almost like not attractive to think about, or is it? Maybe?
Well, it's actually a little bit more attractive than you might imagine. So there's a big debate. Well, there was a big debate. So what I teach the neuroscience first year undergrads is there's a debate in the Cannon-Bard theory of emotion and the James Lang theory of emotion. And this is the same William James that, most people who study psychedelics are aware of. And so the James Lang theory proposed that emotions are actually in our body and that they're a physiological response to a stimulus. And that physiological response, say your heart beating or your skin, the hairs on your skin prickling up, that is information that gets sent up to the brain, and then it triggers the emotion in, say, the amygdala. That idea for many decades was very much looked down upon, frowned upon as unscientific. And the theory that up until very recently was dominant was the Cannon-Bard idea, which is that emotions live in the brain. And this was supported by evidence that if you lesioned or removed parts of the brain, like the amygdala, you could get rid of fear responses. If you stimulated other parts of the brain, like the nucleus accumbens, you could get reward responses. And so for many, many decades, the Cannon-Bard idea of emotions are in the brain was the dominant. But more recently, because of optogenetics, which is a new technology in neuroscience, neuroscientists have been demonstrating that actually there might be more support for the James Lang theory than we had originally thought. So you can interrupt, you can just change the firing rate of the heart, cause it to beat faster, and induce a fear response where there was none, or just stimulate the heart and reduce a fear response, even if there was one, right? And so this idea that some psychedelics researchers and some practitioners, use this sort of somatic approach where they breathe into their body to deal with the trauma, might actually have much more support from the neuroscience community than I think you might imagine.
Okay. So meaning it would make it also easier for the patient or the person using it to not fully remember what maybe has happened to them?
Well, I think this is an area that we need to research, right? I think it would be I think that you need to pair the psychedelic with some therapy. Now, whether this is, sort of cognitive behavioral therapy style or, kind of investigating the root cause of the trauma through sort of more traditional psychoanalysis, or doing more of this kind of body work, I think it's an open question which of those approaches will work better. But I think it's worth exploring.
Okay, and what are you really excited about in terms of research or compounds, psychedelics in the next years? What would you like to look into?
Yeah. So one thing I didn't really mention, which I think is worth sharing, is that in the 2023 Nature paper, we also found that there is a relationship between the duration of the trip and the duration of the open state of the critical period. So the longer the trip, the longer the critical period stays open.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so a drug like ketamine, has a very short trip, and the critical period only stays open for about 48 hours, and then it closes. Psilocybin and MDMA, more like 3 to 6 hours, the trip lasts, and the critical period stays open for about 2 weeks. And then ibogaine is sort of the rock star of the group because it keeps the trip is, anywhere from 36 to 72 hours, and it keeps the critical period open for at least a month, probably a little bit longer. And so I am very interested in understanding that phenomenon. I think that what it suggests is that the trip itself matters and is mechanistically related to this critical period reopening. It also suggests that we need to be paying a lot more attention to what is happening in the days and weeks after the trip than we have been. So I think most of the clinical effort has been placed on preparation and integrate and support during the trip. And then afterwards, there is some instruction to integrate and to take a journal. But I think that really this approach of minimal kind of therapy afterwards is a missed opportunity. And so to really get maximal kind of learning happening while you're still in that flexible, malleable state. And so I'm hoping that more of the clinical trials will start looking at this. What we are focused on is we are trying to apply this critical period framework to stroke, where we think that we could potentially, instead of pairing psychedelics with psychotherapy, if we paired it with physical or occupational therapy, then we can get motor learning after a stroke. And so we are collaborating with Steve Zeiler's lab at Johns Hopkins, and we're starting our first phase 1 safety trial in stroke patients. And we're really taking advantage of this 2-week window that we have after the psilocybin and maximizing the occupational therapy that they'll receive, that learning during that open window.
And what do you think is the role for somebody like you, like a researcher in psychedelics that has now opportunities? How would you describe your role? How do you see yourself? What is your kind of, let's say, task to bring forward? What is the thing you can do for this movement or new?
Well, I mean, honestly, I think that while I really appreciate all of the work that's going on in terms of, creating this movement and trying to move legislation forward, for me, I think I can serve the community the best by continuing to do the things that I feel the most driven to do, which is continue to explore, continue to find new mechanistic explanations, continue to push the envelope on understanding how these drugs work and coming up with new ways that we can use them, and also new potential ways that we need to be careful, right? So this long duration of the open state after the critical period, after the acute drug effects have worn off, really suggests that we need to pay attention during that window and make sure that we're not harming people, that we're not injuring people further or exposing them to bad contexts. The other surprising aspect of this is that, in talking to some of these veterans and some of these drug addicts who have been, receiving such incredible transformation because of these medicines, I find myself suddenly, that part of me that went to medical school reawakened, and I feel suddenly interested again in actually interacting with patients. I find myself to be a little bit of a transformation junkie. I can't.
Really?
It's amazing watching people, who 2 days ago said they had a gun in their mouth to suddenly crying and hugging and, just having a flood of emotions that they had kept bottled up for decades in some cases. And so this is very appealing to be part of that.
Okay. I mean, one last question is the question that I'm thinking about the most, also in my own experiences. Like, so you leave a certain identity behind once you have opened the critical period, and maybe, like a car, and you took out the trash maybe, and then you, like you said, you leave certain activities behind that you used to do more in your PTSD persona, and suddenly you're not that person anymore. So, and I think a lot of people want this, but of course at the same time it's super terrifying because you might lose friends, partners, whatever, a lot of things. So what is your take on kind of looking for a new identity that you will find once you get into a psychedelic lifelong journey, maybe. So,
yeah,
little question.
I mean, it's sort of, it's a tension that, I think is very, you're right, it is very terrifying to people to lose control. The identity that they have right now has protected them and saved them from really hard times. And I think that that's why so many people who come to this are coming to it with as their last hope, right? Their last thing, because they've tried everything the old way, and they've come up against a wall, and so they become available for that transformation only. I mean, I think there's a funny line between, is it courage that brings people there, or they've just they've tried everything else and there's no other shot, right? So yeah, I do think that this is why psychedelics can be so powerful, because it is scary to give up all of your habits that make the person that you are, your personality that you are today, in hope of transforming it into something else.
Great, amazing. Thank you for being on the show. I know you're a very busy person, so I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.
And all the best to your research.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode, and thank you for listening to the show. If you want to know more about how we fast-track psychedelic destigmatization, please head over to the New Health Club podcast on Apple or Spotify. There are many episodes talking about several substances, several treatments, several ways how psychedelics can be used these days. You also find us on Instagram under the New Health Club. But if you want to know more about our nonprofit foundation, the New Health Institute, please head over to www.thenewhealthinstitute.org. Of course, we are here on Instagram too, under the New Health Institute. Very important to me is also that you subscribe to our newsletter on Substack. Please look for the newhealthclub.substack.com. This is very important to me because we really start to build right now a media platform on Substack around psychedelics and new health topics. And of course, we would love your support on this, and love if you subscribe, love if you tell other people, your friends, your family, your community, so we can really kick off this endeavor and actually have another place, another platform next to the podcast where we can get you information and education around psychedelics.